Thank you. I'm delighted to be here today. Take these off. It's my first time in Prague, and I'm sure for many of you, you might not know much about Cork, the city that I come from. Cork is a city in the south of Ireland, known to its people as the real capital of Ireland. We have a population of 200,000 and about 350,000 people in the metropolitan area. In terms of homelessness in Cork, at any one time, currently there are about 420 homeless adults, perhaps 150 or so homeless families, but the number who experience homelessness over the course of a year would be much greater than that. In Cork, homelessness has risen sharply in recent years with a 27% increase just in the last year. Oops. So, Cork Simon Community, which I come from, was founded in 1971 by Anton Wallach Clifford. We work with people with complex needs, people who've often been on quite an institutional circuit, including prison, hospital, addiction treatment, homeless shelter, precarious housing, and perhaps back to prison or back to one of those various institutions. This long-term homeless group and episodically homeless group is not particularly representative of the homeless population as a whole, but if you look at our emergency shelter, for example, about 60 to 70% of all of our bed nights are accounted for by 12 to 15% of all those who attend the shelter at some point in the year. So the small group of people who have complex needs and who have invariably suffered complex trauma account for most of our time, effort and energy in seeking to help them. So in 2018, last year, we worked with over 1,000 people in Cork. We provided shelter, housing and support in housing to about 250 people every day in the city. And our aim is outlined there. As a consequence of our work, we intend to end long-term homelessness and rough sleeping in Cork, and to provide those that we serve with security, stability and support to improve their overall well-being and to be able to determine and pursue their own goals. And that's very important for us, that we're not imposing goals on people, but working with them in pursuing goals that they wish to achieve. So we have a range of services. We have a 48-bed emergency shelter. Again, we had a debate last night about the difference between an emergency shelter and a hostel, but this 48-bed is open 24 hours a day, and it consists of a number of single bedrooms, about 30, with a number then of shared bedrooms with 2 per room. We had to open, because of the rise in homelessness in Cork, we had to open an extra, much more basic shelter in the space where our day service is, which is at the same site, and it's basically 15 mattresses on the ground every night, and that's been running since 2017. It was started for the winter period, but has been kept open because demand has continued to rise, and we're currently looking for a larger space for that because of the growth in homelessness. We have a day centre which is linked to what we call the Adult Homeless Multidisciplinary Team, which is a medical team consisting of doctors, nurses, psychiatrists, occupational therapists, counsellors, and so on, who provide primary medical care to the people who avail of our services and of the other homeless services in the city. We operate a model of care and case management where everybody, particularly those who are longer-term homeless, are assigned a key worker, and We've changed that slightly in recent years to try and ensure that the caseworker follows the client as they move from service to service, rather than them having to start with a new caseworker if they move to a different service. We have a range of drugs and alcohol services, harm reduction, needle exchange. We have what we call an aftercare support and housing service, where we provide aftercare housing so that people who do choose to go into addiction treatment don't end up returning into the shelter or onto the streets, but end up in aftercare housing for a period while we work to provide a permanent solution for them. We operate 5 high support houses. These are generally 11 to 12 bed shared units, congregate units, which provide a long-term home for people who have high needs and for whom our preferred option of housing first and housing-led approaches haven't particularly worked out. We've been delivering our settlement services in line with the Housing First philosophy since 2013, and since then we've accommodated approximately 140 people, and we have an 89% retention rate after 5 years, which means that the vast majority haven't had to return to homeless services. And more recently, within the past year, the government has put Housing First at the heart of its strategy and developed new, better resourced Housing First services. And we're working actually with Focus Ireland and with the City Council and the health services in Cork to deliver a new comprehensive Housing First initiative for the region. We provide employment training and education services because for many people they have goals in terms of employment and education. Many of them left school early, have few qualifications and are keen to gain qualifications. And in recent years we've helped more than 200 people into employment across the city, and we give out about 220 educational certificates to our clients and service users every year. Very important to us as an organisation is the whole matter of policy and campaigning. We campaigned hard for years, as did other organisations like Focus Ireland, Peter McVerry Trust, in the voluntary sector in Ireland, for a comprehensive Housing First strategy. We've achieved the beginnings of that on a national basis, and we are campaigning hard for additional social housing and associate supports in housing and better preventative services, because since the crash in 2008, we've had a growing crisis of homelessness and a huge number of people living in precarious housing and very much at risk of homelessness. So our journey towards trauma-informed care, I don't think it came as any surprise to us or to anybody else working with homeless people to learn that many people who we work with have suffered complex trauma as children and as adults. But this is something that we wanted to examine in greater detail and see how we could be more effective in helping people. So we developed a partnership with University College Cork, which is the university in our city, in particular with Dr. Sharon Lambert from the Department of Applied Psychology. She specialises in trauma. She has provided advice to the British Home Office on trauma amongst refugees. She's also worked with the Irish National Ambulance Service, developing their approach to dealing with trauma. And she took a great interest, having experience in drug services which intersect closely with homeless services. She took a great interest in doing something to help people experiencing homelessness in Cork, and we developed this partnership. Graham Gill Emerson, who at that time was a Cork Simon's addiction counsellor, was also in the lead in developing the research that underpins the work that we've undertaken 2 years ago. So it was very much a partnership between the two of us. And it involved a comprehensive approach. Looking at ACEs. Are people familiar with the term ACEs? It refers to adverse childhood experiences, and it refers to a 10-point scale where you ask people a series of questions about their experiences in childhood, and they range from things like physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, the death or incarceration of a parent, and other traumatic incidences that may have happened. And we undertook some research with our residents and service users on that. We looked at the impact of vicarious and secondary trauma on our staff team. We had Sharon Lambert undertake a walk through our services as a service user from a trauma-informed perspective to assess how well we were set up to deal with the trauma that we're dealing with. And following that, we trained all of our staff, and I mean all of our staff, from the frontline staff delivering services to ancillary staff doing maybe laundry, housekeeping, catering, people in our fundraising department, finance people, administration people, everybody in trauma awareness. And we published a report and have a comprehensive change plan, and I'll talk you through what's happening with regard to that. Okay. That's the same thing with nicer graphics. So to talk about the adverse childhood experiences first. This is a better definition of ACEs than I gave a moment ago. They're adverse childhood experiences when growing up that can deeply impact a young person and profoundly affect emotional and physical health later in life. They're assessed through a 10-point survey covering 10 areas that can happen before the age of 18. Answering yes gives you a score to one item, gives you a score of 1, and you can get a maximum score of 10. They're very common. Most people will answer yes to 1, maybe 2 questions. But as you have more ACEs, you tend to have a much greater impact in terms of well-being. I had a video there which put some of the lived reality of the impact of childhood trauma on one of the people who participated in the study. Not able to access it now, but I would encourage people to have a look at it maybe when it goes up online. So ACEs fall into 2 categories. There's the personal ACEs, which relate to abuse and neglect, verbal abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect and physical neglect. And then there's what happens to other people who you're close to, especially your primary caregivers. So mother treated violently. The ACE tool was developed in America. I don't think they conceptualized that another partner could be treated violently. Substance abuse in the family, mental illness in the family, having a family member in prison, or the loss of a parent at an early age through death, divorce or abandonment. So a sample of 47 of our service users, mainly long-term homeless people, were interviewed, and the average was 5.15 per person, and the range was 1 to 10. So somebody scored just 1, nobody scored none, and there were some who scored 10 as well. And the 3 most common were emotional neglect, domestic violence and sexual abuse. There was a very strong link between ACEs and early drug use. That's people using illicit drugs below the age of 12. And this research alone demonstrated the need for homeless services to have trauma-informed services. So as I said, everybody had experienced 1 or more, but almost 1 in 5, 77.7%, had experienced 4 or more ACEs. And when you score 4 or more, your risk for many different difficulties goes up almost exponentially. That chart there gives you an idea of how many scored each number of ACEs. These are the particular traumas that people suffered, with 75% verbal abuse, 67% physical, 35% sexual, 26.5% physical neglect, 49%, almost half the loss of a parent, 71% substance misuse within the family, 43% domestic violence, just under a third a family member in prison, 60% mental illness in the family, and more than 2/3 with emotional neglect. So quite a range. This is just a slide I got elsewhere, which shows when you have 4 or more what it means. And you can see there, pointer on this, even things, it mightn't be surprising to learn that it's associated with mental health difficulties and with emotional difficulties and depression, but it also impacts on other aspects of your health as well, including things like heart disease and cancer. But you can see there that somebody with 4 or more has 14 times the number of suicide attempts than would otherwise be expected, 11 times the level of intravenous drug use, 3 times the level of lung disease, and it has impacts. I think it was well explained this morning how it disrupts neurodevelopment, how it causes social, emotional, cognitive impairment, leading to risk behaviour, which leads to disease, disability and social problems, and ultimately to early death. And it's not a coincidence that in Ireland the average age of death of a homeless person is 43, where for a person who isn't homeless it's 80 or over, depending on whether you're male or female. So what this shows here is the ACEs in our service users compared to the general public. And as you can see in every single case, the people who we serve have had much, much greater difficulty and trauma in their lives than most people in the general public would have experienced. I'm sorry the slide is a little bit blurred, but I hope people can make it out. Again, you can see there the impact that ACE has in terms of alcohol and drugs, mental health and illness and injury. And in all cases where you have 4 or more, your problems are significantly compounded. There you see the average age with people first using alcohol at 12 years or under, 14 years for cannabis, leaving school at 15, first using heroin at the age of 23, and you see there a whole range of deleterious impacts, from self-harm to head injury to overdose, suicidal thoughts, and engagement with psychological and psychiatric services. Okay. So I'll talk next about the trauma-informed assessment of Cork Simon services. Sorry, yeah. Yeah. Okay. We did a self-assessment, or it wasn't really a self-assessment, as it was done led by Sharon Lambert of University College Cork. And that assesses our readiness for implementing a trauma-informed approach, and it looked at things like staff development, safe and supportive environment, assessment and care planning, consumer involvement and organisation organisation and policy. And it was achieved by the researcher doing a walk through the services, taking a number of our different services and presenting as a service user would. And the services that were involved were our shelter and our pre-stabilisation house. This is a project we call Gateway, where people who are considering moving into drug treatment get essentially involved in a therapeutic community that helps them on that journey into treatment and on into housing. It involved our people engaged in our Housing First services and our high support housing, which I mentioned earlier. And Sharon's conclusion was that largely, I think, because of the quality of our staff and the training that we have in place already for our staff, that we were 90% of the way there. But notwithstanding that, there were a wide variety of areas for improvement in terms of the physical environment, assessments, Cork Simon's own policies, staff care, government policy, and staff understanding of trauma. This was done before we did the trauma training with staff. So if you look at those, the physical environment, again, it varies between our services. We have, as I said, 5 high support houses, which are 12-bedded units. Generally, the physical environment there is very good. Those services operate with what's called a sleepover. I don't know if you have that here, where at night you have staff asleep on site rather than waking. And you'd have 2 sleeping staff. One issue that arose from the assessment of the physical environment there was that for reasons of practicality and space saving, there is a sleepover bed in the staff office where some of our service users would come to talk to staff. And for people who might have had sexual abuse or issues like that in their lives, that wouldn't be a very traumatic space to be engaged, trauma-aware space to be engaging in that kind of work. So that was one thing that came up there. With regard to people on our Housing First, people have their own housing, and a lot of control therefore in terms of the environment, or as much control as anybody else might have at least. But then we have our shelter, which is, a large shelter. When you take in the nightlight as well, we have more than 60 homeless people there every night. Personally, I think that homeless shelters are hostels are a part of an inheritance from the poor laws which were introduced in the 1830s, where they decided they would have indoor rather than outdoor relief of poverty and set up workhouses, poor houses, mental asylums. When Ireland became independent, we took this on with some gusto, opening new ones such as Magdalen laundries, where women who were deemed to be of dubious morality were sent for no good reason. And we also used to have more people incarcerated in mental hospitals than anywhere else in Europe. And now in recent years we've been building more and more homeless shelters. I don't believe it's a proper response to homelessness at the best of times. Obviously you do need temporary accommodation for people, but it should be as short-term as possible and shouldn't be a place where people live their lives. But in our shelter it's particularly difficult because the city is small enough, the homeless services sector is small enough, and we're trying to achieve 2 things at the site. We're trying to provide, on the one hand, a long-term bed for some people who are homeless and support to help them on the journey out of that. And at the same time, we're trying to provide a bed for the night for people who turn up in a crisis. And it doesn't allow for a very a stable environment. Also, one of the things, as I speak, we've set up a trauma-informed working group. They're actually meeting now in Cork as I speak. One of the things we were talking about the last time was the staff office. And in the service, we clearly want to ensure the safety of everybody. And we have a staff office, and in there we have a bank of television screens and a bank of security cameras monitoring various parts of the building, you know, the corridors, the recreation room, the dining areas, and the areas outside the building. But one of the things that came up is that for staff, watching that monitor brings in a sense of hypervigilance, a sense of being on edge, a sense of looking out for something going wrong. And that's not really the right mindset to be dealing with people in trauma. So we're discussing and trying to tease out how best we deal with those kind of issues. So there's a lot to be said about the physical environment. We've made a range of changes, like Robin mentioned earlier, in terms of the colours. We had in the building memorials to people who've died and pictures of people who died in a kind of a shrine. And then we started to think that that's a little bit morbid, because really an awful lot more people get through their difficulties, and we should be celebrating that and have a lot more positive messaging and imagery around the place. In the day centre, we had an awful lot of materials about safer drug use and disposal of needles and various diseases that people might be at risk of sexually transmitted diseases and so on. We decided to move all of them up to the floor in which the medical services happen, because people shouldn't always be confronted with their problems and difficulties. They should have a place where they should relax. Assessments. In Cork, there's a common assessment used by all homeless services, and it's part of a national assessment framework. It has been changed, and positively it includes a lot now of it actually includes an assessment of trauma. A lot of the ACE questions are in it. It's not adequately strengths-based, in my view. It needs to be. We need to start our conversation with people coming into services with the positives about what their hopes and aspirations they have are, and what strengths they feel they might have, whereas we tend to start with a series of problems, deficits, illnesses, and so on, which must be a kind of a depressing undertaking for anybody answering the questionnaire. Staff care is a huge issue, and I'll present the findings on staff well-being in a while. But it has to be said that working with people who suffered complex trauma and who are still living a life where there is much complex trauma, where they don't have a secure place to live, where there's a lot of danger on the streets, has a huge impact on staff. But I'll say more about that later. Government policy can be frustrating. In Ireland, we have something called the habitual residency condition. About 20% of the people we work with aren't Irish citizens. They're people coming primarily from Eastern Europe, a lot of Polish people. And if you don't have a means to sustain yourself, you don't have a right to avail of social services and so on. So there are tensions about that, to say the least, as you can imagine. And it makes the service more difficult to provide, and that's a government policy. And there's also a centre of interest policy. So if you're coming from Dublin, say, where there's a lot of gang warfare related to the drugs trade, and people do present down in Cork in fear of their lives, we're supposed to send them back to Dublin because that's where they come from, and we're not supposed to provide services for them. We do our best to find ways of working around that. So the impact assessment regarding staff, I think that's a statement of the obvious. The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. When you work with people who have complex trauma, when you listen to their stories, when you see what happens, when sometimes you see violent and traumatic events yourself as part of your work, when people die on a regular basis as a result of suicide or as a result of drug overdoses, it has a huge impact on staff. And the impacts, you can label them vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, compassion fatigue, but they put staff at risk of burnout. And we did something called the Professional Quality of Life Survey, which is an internationally used and recognised instrument for measuring these kind of things. And it assesses compassion satisfaction, burnout and compassion fatigue. 53 staff completed the survey. 11 out of 53 had high scores regarding secondary trauma. 9 out of 53 had low scores regarding compassion satisfaction. And at least 6 in 50 had worrying scores regarding burnout. And I think, again, the people most at risk were people working in services like, this is speculation because the staff did it anonymously, but from knowing the services and knowing the people, without doubt, when you're working in outreach services with people living in tents, living under bridges, and when you're working in emergency shelter, that's where you're most at risk. And high scores on those mean that something frightening may have happened to the participant. They may have difficulty sleeping, have thoughts and images of it running through their minds, and try to avoid situations that cause them anxiety. And it can lead to absence from work, and it can lead to, you remember the window of tolerance from this morning that Robin showed you. Can lead to hyperarousal or hyperarousal among staff as much as anybody else. There's a cartoon that's a little bit blurred, but it says if you're just stressed, it's one thing and it's bad enough. But if you fall off the cliff and are burnt out, it's big trouble. And there's the emotional impact that this kind of work can have on people if we don't adequately attend to self-care and well-being. And it's everything. It's guilt, helplessness, mistrust, stress, isolation, irritability, anger and rage, startle retest, avoidance, anxiety and insomnia. In other words, the staff begin to feel very much as the people who've suffered the complex trauma we're trying to address would themselves feel. Don't know if you're familiar with Lassie. Lassie was this dog that on television when I was a child that would always help people out by rescuing them in precarious situations. And in a way, that's a little bit like staff in homeless services. But you do need your own talking therapy and help if you're going to do that kind of thing. But I'm not sure how good it is for the dog. So the training, the trauma-informed training for our staff and volunteers. Again, Sharon provided that. And we trained more than 120 staff over 6 training days. As I said, it included absolutely everybody. Did I accidentally turn it off now? The training content was informed by the outcome of the assessments that I mentioned earlier. It included much of what we had this morning about the neurological and psychological and the window of tolerance, the principles of trauma-informed practice, but also a lot of room for staff to discuss what they feel works well and what they feel would work better in terms of our work across the various elements, the service user element, the staff wellness element, the practice element, and the physical environment. And the feedback received from staff was very positive. People found it extremely useful, said it would make them more aware of the language that they use and the space that they're in when they're engaging with people. It helped people to understand the huge impact and ongoing impact of childhood trauma. And I think as well, it was an affirmation of what we're doing well, but an understanding that there's so much more that we can do. So there was a wide range of recommendations, and the first one there, as I said, formalise the trauma change team. We've done that, and as I say, they're meeting as we speak. Now, we're supposed to review all policies, procedures and paperwork to ensure they incorporate trauma-informed principles. I don't know what it's like in Czechia, but we have about 80 or 100 policies. The number of policies we've had to develop is just unbelievable because of the level of regulation. It's going to take a long time to review them all, but certainly everything that we're developing is looked at in the lens of trauma and whether it's going to help people who have suffered complex trauma. Now, some of the practical issues that have come up to be addressed, like many voluntary organisations working with homeless people, as pressure came on services, we ceded more and more space to put in a new service or to bring in more people into the services and so on, to the point where we actually lost having a dedicated staff room in the shelter, and we've needed to put that back in, which was much more complex than you'd imagine, because properties at a premium in Cork, we had to rent extra space. It took ages to get it, and it's only this month that it's going to be in place. I mentioned the service user memorials, that there's a need for more positive messaging rather than focusing on the deaths and losses that people have suffered. Building signage. There was a big debate over whether we should have a welcome sign welcoming people into the building, because some people felt when you're in a situation, as we are unfortunately, of having to turn people away, that could be experienced as a kind of a slap in the face. What to call the people we serve? I don't know if you have debates like that, but it varies. Focus Ireland call their people customers. We think that prioritises an economic relationship and is inappropriate. Others call them service users. Many people object to the idea of people as users. There's clients, which again some people aren't happy with. There's residents, and we've debated that, and we've moved. We did some work with a group of homeless people, and they were more comfortable with client as a preferred one rather than any of the others. But with further thought, we're actually thinking, because of the range of services we have, that it's different terms for different situations. So if somebody is a tenant in one of our flats and apartments, then they're a tenant, just like anybody else. If they're participating in the Housing First service, they're a participant in that. If they're in one of our house support houses, they're a resident there. If they're in the shelter, they're a guest. So we're bringing that back to the user group now to see if they'll be happy with that. And I think as well it fits in with the notion of social role valorisation. I'm not sure if people are familiar with that, but homeless people, especially people who are entrenched in homelessness, often take on a homeless identity, feeling, stereotyped and persecuted, and being stereotyped and persecuted. If you can work with people about their other identities, they may be a parent, they may be a brother, they may be a sister, they may volunteer on something, they may be a chess enthusiast, whatever it might be. You can help build people's confidence and self-identity beyond homelessness, which allows people a possibility of seeing a brighter future. So matters of language are very, very important. There's the whole area of sanctions, which is very, very difficult. Trying to keep the place safe, trying to be fair, but trying to take account of people's individual circumstances. By sanctions, I mean, obviously we try to be low threshold, but where things happen, where there's violence, where there's racist or sexist abuse and so on, there has to be consequences. How do you manage that? And we have a working group working on it at the moment, but it's a very difficult area because there are strong feelings about it, with some people thinking what makes people safe, and others thinking that actually makes things worse. So it's contentious. Okay, and then finally, that strengths-based documentation. Working on getting the regional and national frameworks changed will be hard work, but we are developing our own strengths-based materials to use in assessments as a first step before going into the more formal ones. I'll go a little bit quickly now because we're under time pressure. So Sharon herself wasn't happy that the ACEs focuses only on childhood trauma. Adult trauma is enormous. People, as I've said, people have overdoses, attempted suicides, involvement in violent death events, terrible losses, etc., as they're adults, and that has an impact too. And the assessment tool should take account of that. But that's still a work in progress. We are working to improve documentation. Reflective practice. We've set up reflective practice groups. That's where, as a support to staff, where groups of staff, and we piloted this with the evening team, which is where most of the difficult incidences occur, meet with an outside person for a bit of essentially group therapy to process what's happened and to be able to leave it behind as they go home. We still have to repeat what we did 2 years ago, and we will do that early in 2020. We are providing programme details in more languages. We have a lot of materials in Polish. We have a large number of Polish service users, and we have Polish-speaking staff and things like that. There's other ones that we've done. We have training sessions on self-care and well-being completed in the current year. We have the staff room this month. We've changed our supervision structure, so staff well-being is given the primary focus in supervision rather than the management and administration elements. We had to put in some extra staff in some of our services because they were under so much pressure, particularly the evening team in our shelter and the outreach team. We've provided external supervision for outreach workers, and we're going to be providing more external supervision for staff in 2020. And we've put wellbeing resources and so on the intranet. We provide mindfulness meditation for staff. We're training staff as mindfulness meditation trainers. We provide counselling for staff and free yoga. So self-care is very important because in helping people, the first step is that your staff must feel okay, must be able to address things that put them at risk of compassion fatigue and chronic stress that could lead to burnout. So that's it. Trauma is at the heart of many of our meetings now, and the paperwork comes up again, and we're doing what we can, but we don't have full control over that. But we have developed a lot of automated systems to simplify documentation and reporting, which reduces the burden of asking people the same questions again and again. There's a man giving a social worker the paperwork they need to show how much time they spend focusing on clients' needs. So I've mentioned the mindfulness training, and we're also reviewing our waiting list systems within the organisation to reduce the stress points in the system, and we've made some positive changes in that regard as well. Given the lack of time, you can see from this that there's a whole range of duties and areas that have been changed or in the process of being changed to support trauma-informed working. And I think one of the most important things is writing it into your strategy as well. What we found is that the more housing-led our service is, the more independence and the less surveillance that we have on the people we're supporting, the more control people have in their own lives, the more housing first type of services that we offer, the more trauma informed it is, and we want to move our model even further away from the old paternalistic, institutional, shelter-based kind of model into providing more and more housing and support in housing, where people can finally have control over their own lives. So that's a picture of Cork by night to finish with. Thank you.